Hello, welcome to week 9, selecting target behaviors. This topic is one that I am sure you either have encountered or will be encountering multiple times over your career, particularly rather, if you're involved with different kinds of clients, different ages over the years, doing different kinds of things. Basically, it comes down to how do we select appropriate target behaviors? On the one hand, people would say, well, what's the most effective thing? Bill should be doing this, he should be doing that, he should not be doing this, based on what you think, versus the person's personal liberties. They have a right to choose and refuse. So, how do we select these target behaviors? Sometimes, and I think for some of you, this may not be. Right now, you're thinking this is not an issue that's coming up. You're working with kids, they're part of a curriculum, everybody's sort of on board. The parents are, as the guardians, are on board. But what happens when even that child indicates they don't want to do a certain thing? What are their rights? And then, particularly once those individuals become adults, um, they still have um, federal law still suggests that they have the rights to to choose and to refuse. So how do we balance um, what a person we think a person needs with what a person with a developmental intellectual disability or developmental disability decides they don't need or don't want? So we're going to read, and hopefully you've already read, these two sort of classic articles. Now they're 30 years old. This one's from 1988, so it's 30 years old, but yet it is still relevant today. The issues that they were talking about in 88, and the Vanderman article is from 1990, 28 years ago, these are the same issues that we're facing today. I see these things when I go to Texas in particular. I see the examples of this over and over and over again. So we haven't nailed this yet. And part of it is because this falls in that category that we've been talking about a lot this semester in ethics around it's these are gray areas. These are ethical dilemmas that, as good behavior analysts, you are going to face. You're going to find yourself involved in these ethical dilemmas. And solving some of these ethical dilemmas, like this one, is not just basic, oh, this is right and this is wrong. It's the consideration of many things, not the least of which are laws. But let's start with these articles and put them in perspective. So this first one, The Right to Effective Behavioral Treatment, by Van Houten, and a few other people you've heard of. John Bailey, of course. You may have heard of Richard Fox. Brian Iwata, of course, I'm sure you've heard of. And Ivar Lovaas, I'm sure you've heard of also. We've read articles from several. I'm not sure we've read any from Lovaas, but we've read several articles. And of course, Bailey is the author of the textbook we're using in this course. So this this article came about because ABA, well, now it's ABAI, Applied Behavior Analysis. Now it's Association for Applied Behavior Analysis, is now international, has an I after it. But the ABA in 1988, probably in 1985, and it took them a few years to come up with these standards, and then publish them, asked this group, and they'll do this periodically, they will put together a task force and ask them to write a paper. They're usually called white papers. I think I gave you guys one on behavioral interventions toward the end of last semester that came out recently, around certain topics. And this one was around the topic of what are the rights of individuals receiving behavioral services. And I think this is really timely. It's 30 years old, older than many of you, but yet it is incredibly timely. As I said, I think it's still really the same issues. So, generally, what this group task force came up with is that behavioral services should include a therapeutic environment, services whose overriding goal is personal welfare, treatment by a competent behavior analyst, programs that teach functional skills, behavioral assessment and ongoing evaluation, and the most effective treatment procedures available. So let's look at those in more detail. So what do they mean by saying individuals receiving behavioral services have a right to therapeutic environment? Well, therapeutic environment is defined as a safe, humane, and responsible environment. Some of the characteristics that they mention specifically are where client preferences are considered. Now, this is an area where I think as a field, behavior analysis, and as an area of serving individuals with intellectual disabilities, we have improved a lot over the years, is moving to a client-focused or person-centered kind of arrangement where client preferences are considered. The other things that they talk about are, in addition to client preferences, are age appropriateness and educational value. So a therapeutic environment is one that includes as few restrictions as possible, client preferences, age appropriateness, the programming focuses on age appropriateness and has a substantial educational value. Now, those are all important things for a therapeutic environment, which people have a right to have. However, some of those come into conflict with each other on a regular basis. Like I see in Texas all the time, these are mostly adult services of adults, usually ladies, middle-aged ladies walking around carrying baby dolls with them, who they love tremendously. They dress them, they hold them, they take tremendous care in them, and they really enjoy interacting with them. So that's clearly a client preference. However, it's not age appropriate, and it doesn't really have any educational value. So there gets us immediately into this topic of selecting appropriate target behaviors. What are the ethics of that? Someone wants to do something like carrying around a doll that is clearly a preference. It doesn't interfere with programming, but it is a preference that that's how they want to spend their free time, is interacting with these dolls. But it's not age appropriate. So do we target that as a behavior, eliminate that behavior? It's an ethical question. And to answer it, I think, that's why we're reading this article, the Vanderman article, and of course the code. The ethical code can help us with that, answering these questions tremendously. But the point is, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer. We really have to consider several factors when trying to address these kinds of issues. All right, Vanderman, I'm sorry, Van Houten et al. Also define an effective, the rights of individuals receiving behavioral services as the right to services whose goal is personal welfare. So they should have services that are primarily focused on personal welfare. What does that mean? Well, to assist individuals in acquiring functional skills that promote independence. Now, again, that is easier said than done, and we'll talk more about that. It sounds good, but what exactly do functional skills, practical functional skills mean? So I see all the time that everybody will have the same kinds of goals, or at least they used to in Texas when we first started. So everybody, for example, would identify the name of the medication they're on, for example, or learn money skills, learn to count or identify a nickel from a dime. Well, it sounds good. And you could say, well, and that's exactly what they said, that promotes independence. But does it really? Is it really functional in every case? If you are never going to actually independently manage your medications, then why is it important that you identify them? And their medications change. If you're on any medications, you probably recognize that. The names change, what the pills look like change all the time. So what's the value? Is that really a functional skill? Same thing with counting money. If you're going to independently go to the store and pay for things and count your change, absolutely. That seems like a functional, practical skill. But if that is not a realistic goal, if that just isn't really going to happen at all, if all you're going to do is hand the person the money, which is fine, but that's a different kind of goal, then why are you spending years? And when I say years, sometimes some of these individuals have been working on discriminating between a nickel and a dime for 10 years. So obviously they're not acquiring the skill. All right, so the right to services whose goal is personal welfare also means that individual and caregivers are involved in treatment decisions. And that is, again, an area that I think has improved over the last 30 years, that now all treatment plans that I've seen in the last 5-6 years have really focused on including the individual and their decision maker, if they have a decision maker, in making treatment decisions and approving treatment decisions. Another aspect of services whose overwhelming goal is personal welfare is the doctrine of least restrictive treatments that we talked about with the BACB compliance code, specifically 4.09, that you use the least restrictive treatment as possible. We've talked about that, so I won't talk about that again. However, Van Houten goes on to say, in those cases when you might have to use a restrictive procedure, then you also need to make use of peer review committees, which are behavioral experts who would review, are you using the least restrictive, most effective intervention? behavioral intervention, and or the use of human rights committees, which are consist of experts in the behavioral field, but also community members who would decide if these interventions that you're using are consistent with community standards. I think both of those have certainly increased tremendously. I know Bailey has talked in chapter 1, talked about the use of peer review committees and human rights committees, and I think larger programs all have those. I would really like to see some of the smaller programs using those also, maybe by grouping together, having people sit down, talk about cases that are having particularly difficult time, or they're not achieving the goals that you want. That is one of the things that we established in Texas for all the behavioral psychology departments, is they weren't doing peer review, that they needed to do peer review. And that is weekly, that they would have a meeting and specifically present individuals who were not making progress, present data and plans, and it would be an interdisciplinary team and all behavioral people, and they would oftentimes modify the plans. Over the years, consistently, I have heard everyone has said they found that to be tremendous improvement, and they're really happy that they started those peer review committees. It's really helpful when you've got additional, and you take the time and you have a set meeting that you sit down together as a team and discuss what you might do. And somebody else who's not so involved in the case might say, gee, have you tried this? Or I've tried this, or there's an article about that, have you read that article? And it almost always results in some good things happening. People learn more about applied behavior analysis, but mostly the consumer benefits and gets a better program out of it. The other right that they've talked about is for people receiving behavioral services is the right to treatment by a competent behavior analyst. All right, so this is one you've got to think about. It was written 30 years ago. When this was written in 1988, there was no BACB. There was no Behavior Analysis Certification Board. So there was no BCBA. And that is, for this reason, is exactly the reason that the Behavior Analysis Certification Board, BACB, came about, and that the BCBA credential came about, was so we could better ensure that the people who are providing these behavioral services are competent. That being said, and as we talked about when we talked about supervision and the supervision code, that there are some basic behavioral skills that now the task lists require that you would get exposure to in the classroom to get the hours necessary and the coursework necessary to be able to sit, and hopefully you would also get in your fieldwork experience. But even beyond that, there are going to be certain things that a behavior analyst may not have experience with. And so competence is, just as we defined it in the code, in the supervision code, we're defining it the same way Van Houten is defining it the same way in this article, which is as experience and training. So a BCBA may be well trained and have their BCBA, but maybe they don't know anything about feeding or severe self-injury. And so if that is the case, then they need to either find somebody who is competent, or take some steps to learn to be competent. And that might be contacting someone who works in that field, reading some articles, taking some CEU courses, etc., in a particular area. All right. Van Houten also says, points out that behavioral individuals receiving behavioral services have the right to programs that teach functional skills. So we started talking about this. What exactly does this mean, functional skills? Well, so target skills should allow the individual to gain wider access to preferred items and activities, social interactions, and to terminate or reduce unpleasant items, activities, or social interactions. So what I think they're saying, and this is absolutely true today and needs to be a guiding force for us, is we are going to select target behaviors and target skills that allow the person appropriate ways and effective ways of getting what they want. Materials, activities, social kinds of things. And just like we can, to terminate or avoid, reduce unpleasant things that we don't want. So as a sort of general rule, that would be how we would define a functional skill. And people have a right, who are receiving behavioral services, to learn about functional skills. Additionally, generally, we should attempt to focus on teaching pivotal behaviors, those behaviors that will lead to more access of more things. So, for example, reading would be a pivotal behavior or skill if that's appropriate for that person, because that's going to open up opportunities for more reinforcers, for more things that a person can do. And generally, we're going to want to decrease dangerous behaviors, because that's going to restrict the person more and decrease their opportunities to control their environment more, which we're defining as being able to access the things that you want and avoid, as much as possible, the things that you don't want. No different than you or I. The fifth area that Van Houten is focusing on, that would define effective behavioral programming, and that people who receive behavioral programming should have, is the right to behavioral assessment. Now, Code 3, that assessing behavior code, made it crystal clear, and now sort of took this section of Van Houten and expanded out. But assessment is a critical component of applied behavior analysis. Code 3 makes it clear, and Van Houten and his task force made it crystal clear back in 30 years ago that behavior analysts conduct assessments prior to making recommendations or developing behavior change programs. And that is a essential component of any behavior programming that goes on. Additionally, there needs to be ongoing evaluation and assessment to determine whether the treatment is effective. So we don't do an assessment, come up with a treatment and then say that's it. This person then continues with that treatment as long as they're in your program. No, we continue to collect data, we continue to assess its effectiveness, and unless you write programs a lot better than I do, you're going to be changing those programs because individuals are going to be changing, and we need to modify those programs to continue to be effective with them. So it's an ongoing process. One that you should always have assessment first, and then assessment should continue because we're going to evaluate progress. Finally, Van Houten talks about another component of effective behavioral programming is to make sure you use the most effective treatment procedures available. This is another area that really gets into the ethics of choosing, selecting target behaviors. So as we've talked about, both when we were going over the code, and Van Houten has talked about, and Vanderman talks about, it is unethical for behavior analysts to use more restrictive procedures than necessary. We use the least restrictive procedure necessary to accomplish our goal. However, it is also unethical, as Van Houten points out, to expose an individual to a non-restrictive intervention that is not effective. So, yes, it is unethical to use a procedure that's more restrictive than it has to be effective, but it is also unethical to expose an individual to a non-restrictive intervention that is not effective. So the point is, it isn't that restrictive is good or bad. You use the least restrictive procedure possible to affect a change. So you don't do nothing just because you don't want to use a restrictive procedure. You use the least restrictive procedure to affect and produce effective behavioral treatment. So the way these articles, the Van Houten article and the Vanderman article, tie together is, so Van Houten in '88 and his committee were talking about what are the components of effective behavioral treatment. However, 30 years ago, and still today, that we still have these discussions of people saying that, well, it's a person's rights to not do certain things, versus it is our ethical responsibility to ensure that the most effective programming is going on. So the issue, the ethical issue, is how do a person's personal liberties, that is the right to refuse, to choose and refuse, work with a behavior analyst's ethical responsibilities to use the most effective programming possible. So this is where Vanderman comes in and attempts to discuss and resolve this issue, or this controversy. But in my opinion, this controversy is going on as much today as it was 30 years ago. If I already gave you this example, I apologize. But again, in Texas, I remember the first year or two we were out there, and now I've been going out there almost 10 years, so it's been a while. there was a individual. This happened to be a student, a kid under 22, um, who was going to school during the day, who lived out at one of the state facilities in Texas that I go to. And he could be extremely aggressive. But a huge reinforcer for him was to get off of the campus, go into the community, and have dinner at like a fast food kind of restaurant. So the behavioral team came up with a response cost so that if he engaged in, or if he did not engage in severe aggression X number of times, if it was less than 2 times or something in a week, then once a week he could choose the place and he could go out and, choose the restaurant of his choice and go out and have dinner. And immediately upon putting that plan into place, this student's aggressions reduced dramatically. And he was going out to eat, and he was happy, the staff was happy, everybody was happy. Well, then one of the human rights people got wind of this and said, well, no, you can't do that because it is his right, personal liberties. It is his right to go into the community. And so, because that's a preference of his. So you can't make it contingent on his behavior. So they immediately stopped the program, went back to it being non-contingent, and his aggressions immediately shot up again. And, the really sad part about this was that not only did his aggressions increase, which was dangerous for him, dangerous for other people, but he wasn't going out to eat either because he was so aggressive every day that it wasn't safe to, after he was physically aggressive on campus, it wasn't safe for them to take him, put him in a van, and take him into town. So he wasn't going out for dinner anyway. So the result of this was his aggressions were up and he wasn't getting what he wanted anyway. So I think that's the essence of this. But how do we balance the right to habilitation, which is effective programming, think about that, with the right to personal liberties? So Banderman and Sheldon and Sherman and Hartchek, who, by the way, I go to Texas with Hartchek, do a really nice job, I think, of sort of laying out this issue and trying to do it in a very objective way. So they point out that a person has a right to habilitation. There's a federal law, or federal laws now, that say that habilitation, or the teaching of skills needed to live independently, are the rights of every person, which is how special education got started. That's the federal law that's supporting probably all the work that all of you guys are doing right now, is that folks who have developmental disability or intellectual disability have the right to habilitation. They also point out that people have a federal, the law makes it clear, the Constitution, that people have the right to choose and refuse certain things, and that's guaranteed by the Constitution. So this is where this conflict, like the example I just gave, came in. Oh no, this is his right. Well, wait a minute. This is the yes, it's restrictive, but this is the best way, the least restrictive way that we can come up with where he can access all of his reinforcers. Ah, that's habilitation. Um, so how do we sort of resolve those two? That you have a right to habilitation, you also have a right to personal liberties, that is, to choose and refuse. Well, part of this comes from a behavioral perspective. Choice is not assumed to be free, and I think, like when we talk about punishment, and that there's society's perception of what punishment is, and then there's the behavioral perspective and definition on punishment, and we need to keep those separate. It's the same thing when it comes to choice. And that is from a behavior. So most people say, choice is free. There's free choice. Of course, Skinner um, famously said that choice is not assumed to be free, but it's a function of historical reinforcement and punishment contingency. So it's shaped. It's the result of what you've been punished. You may like something if it's been associated with a lot of reinforcement. You may not like something if it's been associated with a lot of punishment in the back. So that would suggest that what a person's choice could be a function of what their reinforcement history is, and that we could change what a person might want to do or might like versus not like. But ultimately, the issue comes down to how do we balance one's constitutional rights to choose and refuse, which we can't change, nor should we, with one's rights to effective programming, or as they're calling it here, habilitation. And that's really the essence of what we're talking about this week and selecting target behaviors. How do we decide what's an appropriate target behavior when we have these different issues to choose? So Banderman suggests that one way to resolve this is not to think about habilitation and the right to choose, refuse as two opposite ends of the continuum, that in fact they're not incompatible. So they argue that choice making could be and should be integrated into behavioral programming. And I think today, hopefully most of you are saying as we're going through this, oh yeah, we do that. And, that didn't happen a while ago, but I think it is happening more and more now that, yeah, there's no reason that there can't be choice within programming. Um, a lot of times we can give people choice and it's something that they want to choose. Like I've had a lot of success with people who, when we placed a demand without choice, that is, okay, we're going to do math now, or you're going to go to the gym now, or you're going to do, that resulted in increasing the likelihood that there would be a lot of maladaptive behavior or at least non-compliance going on. Where if we introduced choice, but still allowed the person, the choice not being, well, you can go home and get in your bed versus doing math, but the choice would be, okay, do you want to do math first, or do you want to do reading first, or do you want to go to the gym first? Let's organize these, let's put them on your schedule. You decide which order we're going to do these in. That adding that choice makes a big difference. And Banderman cites a lot of literature to support similar kinds of notions, that we certainly could incorporate choice into effective programming habilitation. Another thing they suggest is including individual input in the development of the target behaviors. And again, I think that that can be really valuable. You run into problems when the person says, I don't want to do that. And you think it is a critical program for the person. The other thing they suggest that I think is more intriguing, and I don't see enough of this going on right now, is teaching individuals how to choose. I think a lot of times individuals with intellectual disabilities aren't given the opportunity to make choices, and they don't really know how to choose. And so, can we teach people how to choose and add more choice to their lives? And I think that the person-centered approach now that most people have adopted, that's the essence of it. That the individual and their decision makers, if they're not the decision maker, are involved in what programming will look like. They make decisions, and that there's a lot of choice within that programming as to what they will be doing or not be doing at any given time. And then finally, they just emphasize that everyone should be given choices to choose and to refuse. I think the conclusion is for Banderman is that in their abstract they really, I think, present this very succinctly, that typically, and they're talking about it as of 1990, but unfortunately, I think it's happening, it's more spotty than it was in 1990. It was happening everywhere this way, but it's still happening in places, that in the pursuit of effective programming, that many behavioral people exercise a great deal of control over the lives of clients with developmental disabilities. They'll choose the goals, determine the daily schedule, regulate access to preferred activities, but there's advantages and disadvantages of allowing clients to exercise their personal liberties and to choose and refuse. But this issue isn't going to go away. And, some of you, again, may be working with kids and their parents are on board, but, and maybe you're not facing this, but this is an issue that is going to, be coming up. What do you do when a person, or if it's a kid, their family says, nah, they don't really need to do that. They don't want to do that. Or I hear a lot that people will use excuses. Oh, well, Bill really wants to exercise more. Well, you hear that a lot, and probably we could all say that. Would anybody say, if you ask the question, would you like to eat better and exercise more and be healthier? I mean, who's going to say no? I think most of us would agree. The point is, when push comes to shove and we have the choice of eating hummus or a cheeseburger, we typically choose the cheeseburger and fries. And so the individuals we work with aren't any different. And so I think sometimes people are who are providing behavioral services are using choice as an excuse, saying this is the person's preference, when in fact they're not doing a very good job of doing a preference assessment and really trying to understand what this person really wants to do. But this is an issue we've got to face. You can't pretend and operate in a vacuum. We have to figure out how we can balance a person's personal liberties, rights to choose and refuse, with a person's right to have the most effective habilitation or behavioral training as possible. Okay, so this week, if you haven't already, read the Van Houten and the Banderman articles. I have two videos that I want you to watch. I think they're both really interesting. The first one really reviews Van Houten's article by Amanda Kelly. I think it's a really nice synopsis of the Van Houten article. So watch that one. The second one, I'll be interested to hear what you think. It's a panel discussion. I don't know if these people are BCBAs or they're students. I think they might be students. I'm not sure what they are. But they're doing a panel discussion on exactly this issue: personal liberties versus effective programming. So I think it's interesting to see what they say. And then there's an assignment that I want you to complete, which to me is very typical. It happens all the time. I can't even count the number of times that I've been involved in variations of this kind of ethical dilemma, where basically a person is not participating in, let's say, an adult is not participating in adult services, day programs, and maybe he doesn't come out of his room. But he comes out of his room to eat. He comes out of his room to do activities of daily living. So he takes showers. He, cleans his room. He does what he needs to do so he's safe. He just doesn't want to interact with people, and he just sits in his room. So the question is, if you're a BCBA and you're working there, do you just let him sit in his room all day, not participate in opportunities to learn new things, to see new things, not opportunities to acquire pivotal kinds of behaviors that are going to open the world up to him? Right now, he basically avoids all social interactions. So what do you do? Do you target that behavior? And if so, how do you go about doing it? Banderman has some suggestions around that. So what I want you to do is think about that, and in your answer, I want you to consider the codes, because there's several relevant ethical codes that we've reviewed, and I want you to specifically list what those codes are and how they're relevant and how they're affecting your decision as to what you would do and why. Also reference the Van Houten article and the Banderman article in your decision. So have fun with that, and we will talk about it more in our next face-to-face class. All right. Have a good week. We'll see you.